Merry Christmas, everybody. You might know Isaiah 9:6 as a very familiar passage, and it says something that is really relevant right now. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Isn't that beautiful? Well, that's very relevant right now to the Christmas season. And I want to bring your attention to 12 really good reasons that we have to support the validity and the reliability of the New Testament. And so I'm going to go through these 12 reasons. And so I want you to stay tuned. But prior to doing that, I want to remind you of something. If you're an atheist, you might not want to stick around. Because as C.S. Lewis has pointed out, for a young man who wishes to remain a solid atheist or a strong atheist, he cannot be too careful of his reading, or I could add, of his YouTube channel watching. And so if you're an atheist, you might want to turn off the channel now because you are going to get a lot of good information in support of the New Testament, and you will find that you don't have the justifications for your atheism. Rather, you have justifications for Christianity. And so let's go. We're going to talk right now about some different reasons for you to support Christianity. So let's get into it. We're going to chat about some really important reasons to support Christianity. And so I want to say hello right now to Slam RN, who is in the chat. And so welcome, Slam. It's always great to see you. One great reason to also believe in Christianity is to consider miracles, which we'll get into in a little bit. But I wanted to bring that up because I see Slam in the chat. And Slam has had some personal experiences herself, which brought her to Christianity and brought her closer to God. And so she was healed in a miraculous way. And you might want to listen to that because I also have it featured on this channel. And so that's pretty important to consider. So as we move in to our case for Christianity, I'm going to go to the current slide we have. Here we go. So we've seen this one. So we have support right now for the Gospels and Acts. The first reason out of 12 is we have honest, albeit embarrassing testimonies. So let's not forget, Peter denied Jesus 3 times after Jesus had named him as his rock upon which he'd build his church. Jesus' family tried to stop his ministry. He dined with tax collectors. It was considered the lowest of the low. A woman who was a sinner in the eyes of the Pharisees washed his feet. And so that could be considered a little bit embarrassing to some people. Only John and the women witnessed Jesus' crucifixion. So where were his other apostles? In fact, where was Peter? Peter was supposed to be his rock. Rather, Peter was hiding. He did not want to have the same fate that Jesus had. He wasn't sure about Jesus. He denied him, as I mentioned prior. And also just note that he had his doubts. We saw that when he witnessed Jesus as walking on water. And when he tried to walk on water himself, he began to sink and he had to cry out to Jesus. Of course, the crucifixion is another really solid reason. Consider why. The crucifixion was rather embarrassing. It was definitely embarrassing testimony as far as the type of the death that the Messiah would face. People who were crucified were the lowest of the low. This was reserved for the slaves. Crucifixion had been invented by the Persians as a means of torture. In fact, even the word crucifixion comes from words like excruciating pain. Also, women whose testimonies weren't to be trusted, according to people like Josephus, discovered the empty tomb. Number two, minor characters were named in the Gospels. And so go to Peter Williams, Dr. Peter Williams, and take a look at his videos on this. But unlike the Gnostics, where only major characters were named, the Gospels included references to minor characters, such as Jairus, whose daughter was healed, Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector at Jericho, Simeon and Anna, who were in the temple when Mary and Joseph brought Jesus there for the first time, Nicodemus, the Pharisee who secretly visited Jesus, Simon of Cyrene, who helped him carry his cross, Joseph of Arimathea, who buried Jesus in his tomb, and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome, who visited Jesus' empty tomb. Those are just a few. But the reason I mention those is because I want you to consider your own life. Now, if you're old enough, go back about 30 years and consider some of the events that you attended 30 years ago. Okay, so consider maybe parties that you went to or those sorts of things. Now, I want you to try to name 30 people who were at those parties. Okay, name some major characters, some minor characters. Okay, I can't do it. I'm thinking back to about 30 years ago, some of the parties that I attended or even held, and I don't remember all of the people. I could maybe name about 10 or 15 people, but I certainly can't name, especially at one party I had at my house that had about 150 people. There's no way I could even get close to naming people who didn't play a big, major impact in my life. Now, the Gnostics only named the major characters, okay? So that's where we differ. This gives us evidence of earlier dating because, again, the memories. We also have historically reliable geography as number 3. As Sir William Ramsay, a 19th century archaeologist and New Testament scholar, set out to dispute the credibility of the Gospels and Acts by visiting the Near East where events took place. He acknowledged Luke as an historian who documented the locations in an entirely valid manner. Now, here's what W.W. Gask says about him. He was, on the one hand, a classical scholar and archaeologist, the foremost authority of his day on the topography, antiquities, and history of Asia Minor in ancient times. And at the same time, he was one of the foremost authorities in the study of the New Testament, especially the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. Few men are able to become masters in one field of study. Ramsay was master in 2. And he pointed out again, the geography of the New Testament is historically reliable. Details like the names of minor towns or the type of terrain, those were documented by Luke, and William Ramsay really supported that. 4, first century dating. So the canon included books that had been written by eyewitnesses or those who knew the eyewitnesses. So eyewitnesses included people like Matthew the tax collector, who offered unique accounts referring to things only a tax collector would want to share. Like, for example, when Jesus told Peter to go to the fish to open its mouth and to pull out 2 drachma to pay his taxes. And John, the beloved disciple, he is the only one who recorded the post-resurrection Jesus account with 153 fish, which a fisherman, which John was, would want to share. Paul, who wrote between 7 and 13 books of the New Testament, noted 3 different times, Luke recorded it in the book of Acts, that Paul was recounting exactly how he saw Jesus on the road to Damascus. Now, let's not forget that Paul had been persecuting Christians at the time. So here's a person who was not celebrating Jesus during Jesus's ministry. Peter the Rock, he also wrote Peter, and James and Jude, who were Jesus's half-brothers. We also have friends of eyewitnesses like Mark, who was a friend of Peter, Luke, who traveled with Paul starting in Acts 16. And then, of course, we have notations that Peter and Paul were martyred around 64 AD or before. So obviously their works had to have been written prior to their martyrdoms. So this is early dating. But even before that, if you go back to the very famous creed, which Paul recounts exactly what people had memorized right away after Jesus' resurrection, was that they had witnessed Jesus' resurrection. And this was noted, even atheist scholars acknowledge, within 5 years of his resurrection. Okay, so 1 Corinthians 15. Go back to that. It's really important. Number 5, early church fathers reference New Testament books to whom the books were attributed. So Prior to 110, Ignatius pointed out Matthew, Luke, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians. Sometime in his lifetime between 69 and 156, Polycarp pointed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, Galatians, Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Timothy, 1st Peter, 1st and 3rd John. Sometime between 100 and 165, Justin Martyr noted and highlighted, this highlights, of course, the validity of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Revelation. Sometime between 130 and 202, Irenaeus highlighted Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Sometime between 150 and 215, Clement of Alexandria highlighted Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then around 325, Eusebius noted that James, the brother of Jesus, he pointed out that he was a brother, authored the first of the general epistles. So now we've got a lot of testimony with the early church fathers providing support to the attributions in the New Testament. You will note when people say that these people who wrote the Gospels were anonymous, take note, all of these church fathers didn't name anybody else and didn't say they were anonymous, okay? So there's no ancient support for those silly assertions. So if somebody is trying to make that claim to you, just laugh. Ha, ha, ha. You're incorrect. We have information to their credibility. Number 6, we've got extra-biblical hostile support that Jesus existed, okay, supported by Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, the Talmud, Marabar Serapion, Suetonius, Thallus, Phlegon, and Lucian. Claims he was born of a virgin. He lived in Egypt at one point. Remember in the Gospels it says, out of Egypt came my son. Some in the outside group, like in the Talmud or the Celsus or Josephus, noted that he had miraculous powers, or they might have called him a wonder worker. A couple of extra biblical support sources like Josephus and Marabar Serapion noted that he was wise. Phlegon said he had knowledge of the future. Lucian said his followers considered themselves brothers. Celsus said he claimed to be God. He was worshipped by God by his followers, according to Pliny the Younger, on a fixed day of the week. He was executed or crucified, according to Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Celsus, Talmud, and Marabar Serapion. So if I want you to go and take a look at what the Quran says about Jesus' crucifixion. The Quran says that God took Jesus to heaven prior to the crucifixion. Okay, they deny the essential portion of the Bible, of the New Testament. Okay, even though they affirm the validity of the Bible, they deny the reason why Christians are Christians, okay, which is Jesus' resurrection. That speaks to, and I bring your attention to Galatians 1:8. In Galatians 1:8, it says, if anyone should claim doctrine that's different from what we're claiming in the New Testament, okay, and they say an angel appeared to them, you're going to want to discount that, okay? You're going to want to discount that believer because they're not believing in the correct truth. So it was very prescient or prophesied in Galatians 1:8 what would occur in not only the Muslim faith, but in the Mormon faith. The Talmud indicates Jesus died on the eve of the Passover. Earthquakes accompanied the death. Now, that's not only noted by Phlegon and Thallus, that's actually noted archaeologically and geologically. Okay, so we know that earthquakes accompanied the death according to a lot of scholarly work of today, where they've actually gone and looked at the Dead Sea Basin, and they've identified marks that indicate right around the year 33, there occurred some earthquakes in the area where Jesus was crucified. Okay. He was buried in a tomb as per Jewish customs. Some people say that he would not have been buried. Well, no, we know that he was buried in a tomb. Okay, it was according to the law, you had to take the body off the tree or off, the crucifixion, off the cross to keep the ground pure. Jewish people would not have supported the idea of allowing Jesus to hang up on the cross and rot. And we have zero ancient support for any sort of mass grave. Okay, that is a ridiculous notion that's been put forth by people who are Jesus mythicists like Richard Carrier without any ancient support. Okay, instead, of course, we've got support that he was buried in 4 different accounts under Joseph of Arimathea's direction in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. Now, of course, that's also put in the book of Isaiah. You can see that there's a prophecy to the point where he was going to be buried in a rich man's tomb. Now, did Jews bury the malefactors, the bad guys? Well, yes, Josephus points that out, and so does Tacitus. Okay. Josephus also said that the disciples said he appeared to them alive 3 days after the crucifixion. Suetonius and Tacitus say that Christians were martyred. Christians who refused to recant were martyred, according to Pliny the Younger, to the Emperor Trajan. His followers made an oath not to commit bad deeds, okay, according to Pliny the Younger. And so we've got some pretty good evidence there. So I'm going to come back to the chat for just a brief moment. And then what we're going to do is we're going to listen to Pastor Mike Winger. So he's got a little bit of commentary on this stuff. So I also want to say hi to people who are in the chat right now. I see my old friend Converse Contender and Susan and Blaster Master. So we got all the good stuff in there. Okay. So let's go over to, we're going to go over right now to listen to Mike Winger, just a few minutes, but he's got some really interesting stuff. And he said this on my channel. So if you guys get a chance, listen to the whole video. It's really good. In fact, it's my second best video of all time. Okay, it's my second most popular video is the one with Mike Winger. I've been trying to get him to come back on my channel, but I think right now I'm such small potatoes that a guy like him who's got, I don't know, 150,000 subscribers, I think he's got more things to do than come on my channel. So, so anyway, we've got that. So here we go. So we are going to listen to this video that I made a long time ago with Pastor Mike Winger. And you can see I had short hair back then. So I was going to ask him a really important question. So I want you guys to listen. Here we go. I listened also a few times to your video with Apologia. And I saw earlier that Apologia had to go to work. So unfortunately, he's not still in the chat. But I listened to your video with Apologia, and you made a few points that you said that are pretty much uncontested by scholars. That when you put these several points together, the best explanation is that Jesus resurrected, as we said he did. And do you recall what those few points were? Because I think those are pretty good. If people just think about that and think, okay, well, what would the atheist, how would they respond to this? Because a lot of atheists will say, well, point one, I disagree with, or point two, I would use this theory, or point three, I'd use that, but they can't come up with a unifying theory of the three. I'm wondering if you wanted to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, like a unifying explanation of all this stuff. So some of the points that I brought up, if I can recall, there's different ways of presenting the case for the resurrection, right? There's like the minimal facts case is easier to do in a debate because you're limiting how many topics of conversation there are. It's really tough to talk about all of the, like if I go, oh, the rise of Christianity, my personal testimony, oh, and let's throw prophecy in there too. It just gets too difficult to talk about in one conversation. So the minimal facts case is like meant to bring us to common ground. It's like, can we just start with what we agree on? Like, and can we say, what explains the things we agree on? And I'm trying to get the non-Christian to agree with the consensus of scholarship on a topic. And then, of course, the empty tomb was more of a majority view, not a consensus view. But consensus means it's like more than 90%. So let's see, Jesus existed. That's mostly undisputed from scholars. So there's that near unanimous agreement. Jesus existed. There is his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, right? Specifically under Pontius Pilate. There is the fact that the disciples several people claimed to have appearance experiences where they saw Jesus and that they meant it. They were sincere about those claims. So they weren't lying is the point. Doesn't mean that the appearances really happened. We're just saying they weren't lying. That's all. And so there was both an individual and group experiences. That's really important because if it was just individual experiences, you can build a better case for hallucination and delusion. But if it's a group experiences of what are called multi-mode, appearances. So it's audible, it's visual, and it's tactile. Okay, so they're touching. There are all these types of things. That's a very rare type of experience, and it's group experiences, which that we don't have any sort of multi-mode hallucination like that to say this happens in reality, and therefore it can explain what the disciples experienced. We have the conversion of not only those who originally believed in Jesus, but those who never believed in him, like Paul the Apostle and James, the brother of Jesus. There's two right there that they'll agree on. So if you take just those facts, we have a real Jesus, really died. They really claimed he rose again. They really believed that they saw him, and they were willing to say so under threat of death. And great suffering. What explains that? Well, the resurrection obviously explains that. Like that, if the resurrection hypothetically is true, that explains all of those facts. And then you could even bring in more facts. Like you could bring in a whole lot more facts. But it explains those minimal kind of like everyone agrees on this type of facts. What else do they do? Well, they could say, well, they hallucinated. Okay, but that doesn't really quite explain the multi-mode nature of these hallucinations. It doesn't explain the research done on hallucinations that says that that's not really. Hallucination is the most popular theory for skeptics today, especially in the circles that we're kind of interacting with people in. But you can't validate that with actual experimentation to suggest this is how we know this really happened. So it ends up being a general unreasonable skepticism towards the supernatural. And they'll say things like, you can't prove a supernatural claim because one's never been demonstrated. Have you heard that before? You can't prove one because it's never been demonstrated, which is what you call circular logic, right? You have to demonstrate it before you can prove it. Wait, aren't we using demonstrate and prove synonymously here? Aren't you saying that you have to prove it before you can prove it? Okay, that's just an assumption that it's not true. But that's often what it will come down to is either I'll assume it's not true, or I'll try to create this crazily unreasonable standard for proving your one claim of Jesus. It'll be a different standard. Everything else in life I'll prove normally. It'll be mundane proof for that stuff. But no, a claim of Jesus has some kind of ultra proof I'm not willing to even explain or identify. Some standard of proof that I'll never put out. Here's the proof I would need, right? And that's ultimately, this is just to bring me back to my skepticism. It's just kind of an impervious skepticism. It's omnipotent skepticism. It cannot be overpowered at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback on what you said, as far as the hallucination, I read something by Mike Licona on hallucinations, and he talked about, people, just like a dream, we don't share a dream. Hallucinations are internal, and people can't share a hallucination. So we had groups of people witnessing Jesus, we had singular people witnessing him, but there wasn't. It's not a possible, solution to say that's a hallucination, because that's, like, again, internal, and not something that's shared. So that is the point with that particular video. So I just wanted to share that with you, and I've got some more to share with you. So we're going to go back to some more reasons. So here we go. I want to say hi before I get there, though. I want to say hi to some more people I'm just noticing in the chat. I see that we've got 6-stringed acoustic bassist, Jules B, and Brother John. So thank you so much, you guys, for showing up. And we're going to go now to a few more reasons to support the validity. Okay, we're talking about the content validity. So it means that we've got a lot of information in the Bible surrounding the whole ministry of Jesus. We've got adequate information to show validity for the story of the resurrection. And we also have the reliability, which means that it is consistent with ancient documents. And so I gave you some extra biblical material that shows consistency just a little while ago. So you did see that. You can't pretend you didn't see that if you were here. So here we go. So we were on this slide of number 6, again, the extra biblical support. But we're going to go now to the next slide. Just to mention, kind of piggybacking on what Pastor Mike Winger said, the theories to refute the resurrection are without merit, okay? The swoon theory that Jesus faked his death has no ancient evidence. It fails to explain the change in the apostles as well. Okay, the twin theory that Jesus had some secret twin. Again, we have no ancient evidence. This is pure speculation by desperate people. And again, of course, that also fails to explain the change. Why did the apostles come out of hiding? Why did they decide they were going to preach for Jesus for decades, despite the fact that they were stoned, beaten, imprisoned? They were tortured. They ended up being martyred in many cases. So we know that Peter was probably hung upside down. We know that this occurred at Vatican. We're at the site of Vatican right now. In fact, on this rock, when Jesus said he was going to build his church, the Catholic Church was built on top of Peter's tomb, just to mention that. Okay, and also the twin theory fails to explain the change in the apostles. Why did they suddenly believe they saw the risen Christ and preach for him? Buried in a mass grave, like I pointed out before, zero evidence. Okay, zero evidence. The disciples stole the body. Again, we have no body. You can imagine that the Romans and the Jews were definitely looking for the body so that it could disprove this new movement that they thought was diversion. They thought it was getting away from the ancient text of Judaism. They thought that these new people who were following the way were causing a lot of havoc. Okay, so we had a lot of issues with that. Again, like I pointed out, the mass hallucination is impossible to occur. Scientists have noted that. Mass hallucinations they're not shared. Sorry, they're internal. It's like a dream. The disciples conspired. Now, why would people do that? Okay, it wasn't like they were getting fame, fortune, material wealth, anything like that. In fact, they were tortured for their beliefs, but they were uniquely positioned to know the truth. They knew that if what they saw was true, they knew if what they saw was a lie, they clearly would not have kept preaching for Jesus for decades. And then the case that miracles are impossible, well, we have tons of evidence, which I'm going to get into in a little while, like with Barbara Comiskey Snyder. So number 7, Jesus's apostles were doubtful and Paul was persecuting Christians. Okay, so this is what occurred. During Jesus's ministry, his half-brothers, including James, tried to stop his ministry. They thought he'd gone mad. His apostles didn't understand what he meant by rebuilding the temple, his body, after it had been destroyed after 3 days. But on the road to Emmaus, Jesus started opening their eyes so they could see the prophecies. There's 330 Old Testament prophecies at least that Jesus fulfilled. During his crucifixion, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. He and the other male apostles, save for John, went into hiding to avoid a similar death. And then, of course, as I mentioned prior, Paul, who was also known as Saul, was busy persecuting Christians. He stood at the feet of St. Stephen. Now, Stephen was the first Christian martyr to be stoned for his beliefs. And of course, as we know through history, the very first few hundred years of Christianity, 280 years to be precise, in those years, they were sporadically persecuted under different emperors. Okay, some were worse than others. So Diocletian, right before Constantine finally legalized Christianity in the year 313, Diocletian had decided that he was going to burn a bunch of the Bibles and to persecute Christians. And so one of the reasons we don't have as many documents as we could possibly have had from the early times is because you had emperors like Diocletian going around burning Bibles and other scrolls, other information. So it was actually in that time, it wasn't full Bibles. It wasn't put together quite like that, but it was a bunch of scrolls that were accepted to be part of the canon. And so he was trying to destroy that stuff. We also know from Dr. Lydia McGrew, and I highly recommend going to her book and looking at the undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and the other parts of the New Testament. Now, what is that? What does that mean? Well, it means that the authors did not collude on putting together their testimonies or their beliefs or what they were passed down to them. They did not, like, for example, in the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus asked Philip where they could go for their goods, and Philip knew the answer because Philip had been a resident in that area. And so you can go to John 1:44 and 6:1-7 and cross-reference that with Luke 9:10-14. We also know with the case of Pilate, we can see in John 18:33-38, 19:6-12, and 19:19-22 that Pilate seemed very apprehensive. Okay, he even sent Jesus away for a little while to Herod because he was trying to not be the one whose hands Jesus' blood was on. And so he did not want to be guilty. That's why he washed his hands and said that he was not going to be held accountable for this sort of activity. Now, why was Pilate so apprehensive? I mean, Jesus was just a humble man, a carpenter. Why would he be so apprehensive? Well, we can go to Matthew 27:17, and we can see that Pilate's wife had a dream. And she had a vision, and she told Pilate, do not have anything to do with that man, because she knew that there was something more special about him, that divinity was coming through. Number 9, again, this is of 12. We've got lots of prophecies fulfilled, okay, including 330, but here's some highlights. In Micah 5:2, we know that Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem. That is why the Magi consulted with the Jews when they wanted to figure out exactly what was going on with the star they were seeing. Now, the star, as we know today, was likely the planet Jupiter. Okay, so they were seeing that. We also know that when the Magi appeared, it goes contrary to what the Christmas story these days tends to be told. They put the Magi at Jesus's birth, but actually we know that the Magi came within the 2-year period after Jesus was born. Now, a lot of estimates are that Jesus was born on 9/11 of the year 3 BC. Now, that's not in stone, but those are some estimates that some scholars like Michael Heiser have come to. And I've been talking to people like Rob of Sentinel Apologetics, who has some information to show that the way the stars were aligned right around the time of December 25th of the year 2 BC. Again, that's after Jesus's birth. I know it's confusing with 3 and 2 BC, but we also know that that is likely when the Magi appeared with their gifts. Malachi 3:1, we know that Jesus was supposed to appear in the second temple. It's mentioned that the anointed one would appear there. Now we know that the temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. So what happens now? Okay, atheists, this is a point where you might want to plug your ears. You're not going to like what I have to say. Okay, the temple was destroyed in 70. So now we know the Messiah, the anointed one, had to have appeared prior to the year 70. Okay, we also know that the Pharisees and the Jewish people were expecting the Messiah to come in that period. Now, again, plug your ears, atheists. Sanhedrin 97 and 98. Take a look at those if you want to see what the expectations were of the timing of the Messiah from the Jews. They realized there were 2 types of Messiah. They pointed that out in Sanhedrin 97 and 98. Take a look at those verses. You can find them right online in Sephora. Okay, so take a look at those and you're going to see that they knew exactly when he was going to come. They knew that he was due that century. They also knew that he was going to be of one of 2 forms. Either he was going to be like the Zechariah 9:9, humble one riding on a donkey, okay, or he was going to be like Daniel 7, coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, which one was he? Well, he was the humble one. And they actually attributed that to their own sins. They realized if they were still sinning, they were still not looking right in the eyes of God, that God would send someone humble as Jesus was. Okay. We also know from our Christian beliefs that Jesus is going to come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. That's from Daniel 7. Now, did we hear any references? Did Jesus refer to himself as God? Let's see. Let's look at that. The Muslims, they tend to think that Jesus never claimed to be God. Well, they couldn't be more incorrect. Any of the Gospels gives information that Jesus pointed to himself as the Messiah. Okay. We also have miracles that were committed that Jesus did. He forgave people. He walked on water. He did all sorts of things that were expected of the Messiah. But what else did he do? Well, if people are wondering what he did, 82 times in the Gospels, it has written that Jesus was claiming to be the Son of Man. Now, that's a reference, of course, we go back to Daniel 7. And Jesus told the Pharisees when they arrested him, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, what is that? What is that? Well, the Pharisees knew exactly what that was. They knew he was claiming to be the one sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. That is God. Okay. You don't sit at the right hand of the Mighty One unless you are at his same level. Okay. So Jesus is at God's level. That is why they decided to crucify him. They didn't like what he was saying. And according to people like Caiaphas, who was a high priest, they figured they could kill one man to save their nation. They wanted to save their goods. They wanted to save their synagogue. They wanted their riches and their wealth. They were scrambling to save that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, due to that, they were blinded. Even though they saw evidence that Jesus was busy committing miracles, like, for example, they saw a blind man who had been blind and suddenly he saw. They asked him, they questioned him, hey, what's going on here? He says the blind man who was blind, who suddenly could see, who had been blinded since birth, told them that, yes, he had cured them. And of course, the Pharisees had been blinded themselves, spiritually blinded. Now, Isaiah 7:14, I mentioned, this is the one that talks about the virgin giving birth. Now, reference this with Genesis 3, where we know that Jesus was going to come in the form of a seed of a woman. Okay, not semen from the man, seed of a man, it's seed of a woman. Okay, so we have that referenced. We also have 9:6, which I opened with. 52 and 53 point to things like he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquity. By his sins, by his death, our sins are made free, essentially. Psalm 22 also points to the crucifixion, talking about pierced hands and feet. Okay, again, Psalm 22 was written about 1,000 years before Christ. Isaiah was written around 700 years before Christ walked the earth. Zechariah 12:10, I mentioned 9:9, that was the humble servant, but 12:10 also speaks of the crucifixion. Okay, so we're given a lot of information in the Old Testament, you guys. Go back to that, go verify it, go look in the Jewish books, and you will find this stuff. Number 10, the Divine Council and the Pentecost. I'm really excited to share with you what Michael Heiser had to say on my channel. Okay, so listen to this. And I'm coming right back here to say hi to everybody. So wait till you see what Michael Heiser had to say. This is going to be very convincing. So let's see. Share audio. Okay. So here we go. This is Michael Heiser on my channel not too long ago, September 16th. And you can see in the chat here, Scholar Fiction was busy asking strange questions. That's okay. People are allowed to ask strange questions. So here we go.
Peter accepted the sons of God in Genesis 6 as supernatural beings. So I thought I might want to do that too, because I don't want to get in a fist fight, with Peter, in heaven. Like, it'll last too long. He should know. He's writing under inspiration as well. So I'm kind of cornered. But the real problem with it is not the weird stuff. It's not the weird Nephilim. It's not all that. That's where people sort of get wrapped up in, because we have to realize that the first 4 verses that describe this lead to verse 5. And verse 5 says, something to the effect of God looked at humankind, and every imagination of the thought of humankind's heart was only evil continually. How do you get that from a supernatural rebellion? Now, we know, and again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, for the sake of our time here, but we know how that's done because of what Peter does. He compares somehow the angels that sin, and Jude does it too, with false teachers. That might be a clue. Okay, why does he do that? If it's in reference to Genesis 6, I don't see any false teaching going on there. Well, that's because you don't know the backstory to Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And the backstory to Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is a Mesopotamian story of the Apkallu. And Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is responding point for point to that story, which glorifies the things that the divine beings who came down to earth in Mesopotamian lore and cohabited with human women and produced giants, and they taught people things, the things that make Babylon great. Well, the things that make Babylon great are things like weapons of warfare, idolatry, astrology. I mean, we actually get them listed in books like First Enoch. And you say, well, Enoch's outside the Bible. Well, that's wonderful, but it's just too bad that Peter refers to it, and so does Jude. And who cares? Biblical writers read books. Okay, the Old Testament writers use the Baal cycle when they want to poke Baal in the eye. Is there something wrong with that? No, it's a communication strategy. But anyway, Enoch is valuable because the writer of Enoch, whoever that was, knows the Mesopotamian story that's behind Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And then, reversing Hermon in the Demon's book, a little bit in Unseen Realm, not too much. I get into that. And I say all that to say that in Judaism of the Second Temple period, they had a couple weird ideas that we would think weird. They would say that what happened at Genesis 6 led to the proliferation of depravity on the earth because humans taught things they should not have been taught by supernatural intelligences. Things that helped humanity not only move further away from the true God that they're estranged from because of Genesis 3, but that also helped humanity destroy themselves more effectively by sowing chaos in their own lives and between them and their neighbors. That's the big deal with Genesis 6. That's why it's a concern. And they also had another weird idea that the disembodied, when you killed one of the Nephilim or their descendants, that disembodied spirit, that's where demons come from, which sounds crazy. Demons coming from disembodied, dead, giant clan guys, where'd they get that? Well, they get it from passages like Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 32, where you have the Rephaim in the underworld. I mean, the people who write this stuff in between the Testaments are looking at their Hebrew Bible because they think the Hebrew Bible is inspired. They think it's the Word of God, and they're trying to take the data points there and make sense of them. That's all they're doing. And then you have a third rebellion later on at Babel, and this is the genesis of your question. Pardon the pun there, but you get to Babel and you say, well, how can Mike put that as a supernatural rebellion? I've just read the story, Genesis 11, 1 through 9. I don't see any angels or demons in there. Well, okay. You might want to go look at Deuteronomy 32, which references the Babel event. And this I never saw because, again, almost all of our translations are not using the Dead Sea Scrolls in verses 8 and 9. and verse 43 as well, because that loops back to the gods as well. And that is, if you go to Deuteronomy 32:8, ESV does, NRSV does. The new NLT actually, does as well, even though it's a looser translation. But ESV says something like, when the Most High, and again, we know who that is, that's not a brain teaser, all right? When the Most High divided up the nations and fixed their borders, their boundaries, okay, well, when did that happen? When did the nations become the nations? Well, okay, Babel, Genesis 10, they would get the list of nations, that's easy. When he did that, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. There's that bothersome phrase again.
Mhm.
And then verse 9 says, God divides up the nations according to the number of the sons of God, but Israel is his own, allotted inheritance. It's his own people. Jacob is his own. He takes Israel for his own. And it's like, well, that's just kind of weird, like, does the Bible, is there any other verse that comments on that? Yeah. There's Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20, which has the host of heaven being allotted to the other nations, so don't worship them. You have Deuteronomy 17:1 through 3, which calls the host of heaven Elohim. You have Deuteronomy 29:23 through 26, which again uses allotment language of the gods of the nations. They are allotted. In other words, what happens at Babel is God is fed up. He is fed up with humanity. And this is why I call it the Romans 1 event of the Old Testament. That God says, okay, you don't want me to be your God. We had a flood. We thought everything was fixed. I repeated the Edenic mandate. You're supposed to disperse and be multiply, and all this stuff that Adam and Eve were supposed to do. What do? You build a tower. Okay, and everybody in biblical scholarship, believes that the tower was a ziggurat. Okay, what's a ziggurat? It's part of a temple complex. Why do you make one? Why do you build a ziggurat? Part of a temple complex. Well, you build temples for one reason: to locate the deity where you are. That's why you do it. You build the deity a house. Come here and live. And God's like, no, I said you go out there. I'm not coming over here. In other words, Yahweh will not be tamed. He doesn't take orders from his creatures. And he's had it. So what he does is he divorces humanity. He cuts them all off. Every last one of them. Our relationship has been severed. I'm going to assign you, I'm going to confuse your language, make you nations and all that, and I'm going to assign you, allot you to other gods, other members of the heavenly host, other Elohim. That's all Elohim means. It's a word for a spiritual being. I'm going to assign you to other Elohim, and I'm going to assign them to you, so it's like two sides of the same coin. And we're going to see how that works. Now, God doesn't hate them, because as soon as God's done with that, he says, now watch what I'm going to do. You might think that since I divorced humanity, I've given up on the Edenic plan. Aha, I have not. I'm going to go call Abram, this guy in the Ur of the Chaldeans, and I'm going to call, him to raise up a new family, like a new Adam and Eve kind of situation, a new family with him. And his wife, get this, his wife can't have kids. She's perfect. Because no one will be able to deny that the creation of this new humanity, which will be Israel, is a supernatural act. Isn't that awesome? So God goes to Abraham, makes a covenant with him, and then he says, now, I just want to be clear, it's going to be through you and one of your descendants that all of these other nations that I just divorced are ultimately going to be blessed. So I haven't forgotten about them. I've given them placeholders, and again, they're under judgment. I'm punishing them. Okay, we'll get back to them. I'm with you now, but we'll get back to them. And we learn from Psalm 82 that this is what God is angry about. We don't know when, we're not told when or how, but the gods of these nations, instead of looking at the situation going, hey, God put us in charge of these people groups, and God made a covenant with this guy, Abram, and in the covenant, God said, I ultimately want the nations to be blessed. So God's still interested in them. So, if we're smarter than a fourth grader here as a supernatural being, we might want to treat them well, at the very least, govern them according to God's nature and his character, because he's going to come back to them. He's going to be watching. No, instead, again, verses 2 through 5 in Psalm 82, They sow chaos among the nations. They destroy their populations. They enslave them. Injustice is rampant. Even in Deuteronomy 32, these other gods, the Shadim, English translations typically translate that as demons. It refers to a territorial entity, which makes good sense because Deuteronomy 32, the nations of the world. Instead of that, they actually seduce Yahweh's own children to worship them. The whole thing is just on fire. It's a dumpster fire, okay? and so God is angry and says, look, I said to all of you, verse 6, you're all gods. Yep, you are. And you're all sons of the Most High. Yep, I remember appointing you, but you're going to die like men. You're going to fall like any prince. And then at the end of the psalm in verse 8, the psalmist rises up and says, oh God, take back the nations. I mean, what you have in Genesis 1 through 11 is 3 episodes of supernatural rebellion and human rebellion operating in tandem to make the world ground zero for ungodly chaos, okay? The world is anti-Eden. It is everything Eden would not be, okay? And this is why. So we have, when Paul, look at the questions we don't ask ourselves as Bible students. Again, this was me. I was a doctoral student. I should have known better. But I never asked myself a simple question like, hey, I was reading Daniel 10 today, and, Daniel has these supernatural princes over nations. Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece, and they're duking it out with Michael, who's the Prince of Israel, I get the idea. These supernatural beings are the powers behind the human tyrants there. That's kind of cool, but where did Daniel get that? Where did he get his theology? Without Deuteronomy 32:8, you have nowhere to go. Okay,
Yeah,
I'll tell you where he got it. He got it from Deuteronomy 32:8. That's where he got it. And that informs, again, other passages in Deuteronomy. So you know what's going on. Where does Paul get, why does Paul use geographical dominion terms like principalities, powers, rulers, thrones, authorities? He uses like 7 or 8 of them. Occasionally he'll use the word demon. Most of the time it's this other vocabulary. Why does Paul use those words and not just like a generic term like demon? Because he's the apostle to the Gentiles. He knows Deuteronomy 32. His mission is to the nations, and they are under dominion. He's got a very clear picture of it. In Demons, again, you haven't read that one, but I have a long passage from Plato showing how beautifully Plato, 600 years, before, BC, articulates the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. See, Paul knew that the Greco-Romans had the same worldview, but what they lacked was understanding that, okay, Paul, I'll play Paul here for a while. Paul goes into a pagan Gentile city. Yeah, it's just like any other one. We start at the synagogue because that's what we're supposed to do, and then we get kicked out. Before we go to jail, we have conversations with pagans. So he preaches Christ to them, and he understands very clearly that, look, I know what's going through your head. You're thinking that if you believe in Jesus, if you turn your back on these other gods that you worship, you think you're in serious trouble because you believe that you're supposed to worship XYZ God because the bigger gods have allotted them to you because they say so. And if you turn your back on that, they're going to get you. You're going to be punished. And so Paul says, don't worry. The Most High, who set up this whole system as a punishment back at Babel, became a man, Jesus of Nazareth, and he died, for you, and then he rose from the dead, and then he ascended to the position of authority. And then Pauline language here. He stripped away their authority. Okay, he defeated the principalities and powers. In other words, they're still there and they're going to hang on to their turf, but their authority to rule you and demand your worship is over. It's done. They have no claim on your life at all, and they are subservient. They are lesser than the God of Israel who became incarnate in Christ.
Isn't that beautiful? So I know you'd appreciate that. So Michael Heiser, I would recommend his books. He's got a book called The Unseen Realm. I've read his other books that he's written, like Angels. It's really good. Unseen Realm, of course, is really good. Reversing Herman. So Michael Heiser talks about ground zero for demonic activity, which happens to be the place where Jesus was casting demons out of people. And so when he cast the demons out of the legion of demons out of one person who had been possessed, the demons ran into a herd of pigs and then into the water. And one of the reasons why I'm pointing to that is because that also occurred right around Mount Hermon. So Mount Hermon was ground zero. And so look at his book, Reversing Herman. What you're also going to note that when Jesus brought the 3 apostles with him up to the mountain, it's very likely that was Mount Hermon. And that's where he transfigured in front of the apostles, James, John, and Peter. Okay, so he transfigured in front of them. Now, what does that mean? It's really interesting because that occurred right after he had noted that people among them, among his followers, would be seeing heaven. And they, as his transfiguration, pointed to his heavenly figure. Okay, and in front of these apostles also appeared Elijah and Moses. Now, Peter was sort of dumbfounded, didn't know what to say, so sort of just started saying, well, maybe I'll build you a house, silly stuff. He just wanted to speak. He didn't know how to approach that. They were really shocked and in awe when they saw this occur. The other thing that Jesus said on this mountain, he said, on this rock, and you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, pointing to Peter being the rock. Now, the bottom line right here is interesting, is he was telling the demons within this ground zero place that he was going to be building his church, and the powers of hell will not overcome it. He also noted to Peter. And so the powers of hell have not prevailed. And so that's something that's pretty great. And so now we're going to go to a few more of my reasons. So here we go. We're going back to some more reasons for you to believe in the reliability and the validity of the New Testament. Now, consider number 11, the early church against all odds. Okay, they didn't have power, they didn't have money, they didn't even have a formal church. They would have house churches set up back then. But in the first 280 years after Jesus resurrected, again, we believe that that's right around April 3rd of the year 33, about 280 years in the year 313, Christianity was finally legalized, given legal protections. But there's one point in the early church that's mentioned in the book of Acts that you might want to consider. Just take a look at Acts 5. You're going to see that Peter and another disciple had been arrested because they were preaching in the temple, and the Pharisees did not appreciate that. They did not want them to be coming to preach. But Peter was persistent, and he wasn't afraid of the Pharisees. And he basically said, who should I listen to? Should I listen to you, or should I listen to God? And so Gamaliel was the teacher of the law. He was also a very respected Pharisee. He happened to be the one who instructed Paul. So he had a really good reputation. He'd given Paul a lot of instructions, and he probably saw what Paul was doing. And so he told the Pharisees to let Peter and the other apostle go. Here's what he said. He stood up in the Sanhedrin. He said, men of Israel, carefully consider what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, all his followers dispersed, and it all came to nothing, and after him Judas. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go, for if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it's from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. Today, we have about 2 billion people who worship Jesus in the world. Now we have about over 7 billion people in the world. We're still working. We're still busy covering all corners. We do have Christians in every nation of the world. Okay, so we've got that going for us. Christianity is not in its home base. That's not the center focus. Actually, Christianity spread out and really took off following its time in Europe. So Europe actually at one point was sort of the home base of Christianity. And you're going to notice if you go back to the book of Daniel, something that's quite interesting and prescient of Daniel. He prophesied that there would be 4 kingdoms. Now, of course, prophesied about Babylon, which was a kingdom during his time. It was a great kingdom. Then we know after that came Medo-Persia, with Darius the Mede and the king of Persia. Okay, then we know after that came the Greek kingdom, Alexander the Great. And then we know after that came the Roman Empire. Okay, and so the Roman Empire ended up splitting off into 2. And the Western Roman Empire, which was based over at Rome, which is the foundation of the Holy Catholic Church, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which was in Turkey, in Byzantine. So we have these two different areas, but the eastern one lasted longer, but they both ended up kind of floundering just as Daniel had predicted. Okay, so go back and look at the verse on the dream from Nebuchadnezzar and reference exactly what happened in these four kingdoms. Now we are living and existing in the fumes of the Roman Empire. We also know from the book of Daniel that Jesus, the anointed one, was going to appear in the fourth kingdom, which he did. Okay, so as I told you before, a little bit earlier, the Sanhedrin knew that there would be Messiah coming at that time. They had expected him. A lot of people were claiming to be the Messiah. You can see here from Gamaliel, we've got at least two. From other people I've seen on Twitter, these other Jewish people, they've told me there were, dozens of people who claimed to be the Messiah right then. But when they ask me whether I even recognize any of their names, I don't, of course. I don't recognize Theudas. I don't recognize anyone else that came around then. The only one we recognize, the only name that's the most recognized name in history, and the Bible that's the best sold book in history, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, is Jesus. Okay, so Jesus is the most recognized man. You go to anybody, whether they're in the land of India, Hindus, people know who Jesus is. They consider him just another one of their gods. Okay, if you go to the Muslim faith, you're going to look at that's about, a lot of people follow the Muslim faith. It's something like 1.6 billion people follow that faith. They consider Jesus a prophet like Muhammad. Okay, they don't deny that he existed. So again, just like the mythicists do, it's kind of ridiculous. Jesus did exist. All right, so let's go to the last one, number 12, miracles today. So you can see here from this paper, the Rock Island paper in Illinois, we can see what happened to this Barbara Comiskey Snyder. She was bedridden. She was in a wheelchair for years. She couldn't move very well at all. Her hands and her feet were crumpled. She was suffering from the effects of multiple sclerosis. Her lungs had pretty much collapsed. She was in dire straits, and her loved ones had decided that they were basically going to let her die because she was in a miserable state. She was well known at her church as being someone in a wheelchair who'd been worshiping Jesus for many years. The church and the radio stations in the area decided to try to get people to pray for her. And so people began praying for her intensely. So then suddenly, as she's sitting in her bed, Barbara heard the words, "My child, get up and walk." And she did. She got up and she could walk. In fact, she started dancing. She went to her church that afternoon. It was a Sunday afternoon when they held service. And she walked down the aisle. And guess what? People cheered. This was a miracle. This was also in the early 1980s. And she is still without MS today. So never doubt. Now you say to yourself, well, that's just one person. Maybe this is a fluke. Well, no, not really. Consider this. All Christian churches in China practice some form of healing. In fact, according to some surveys, 90% of new believers, now remember that China has over 1 billion people. It's got about 1.4 billion people living in China. And it's one of the big sources of Christianity today. It's growing there. Underground churches, but they're growing, okay? They are thrilled when they see a Bible, okay? 90% of new churches cite healing as a reason for their conversion. It's especially true in the countryside, where medical facilities are often inadequate or non-existent. That's according to Edmund Tang, Yellers and Healers, Pentecostalism and the Study of Grassroots Christianity in China. Now, a Pew study, which is of 10 countries, found that around 200 million people claim to have witnessed miraculous healings. And that should be enough to give you evidence to support the reliability and the validity of the New Testament. And so I also want to say, I just popped back here in the chat and I see I've got a super chat waiting for me, which is really nice. So thank you so much, John. It says, ultimate love, we can imagine a friend giving up their life for you because they love you. But would you give up your life for your enemy like Jesus? Okay, I'm going to tell you a little quick Christmas story. You might have heard it before because I've said it before, but it was told for the first time by a pastor called Stephen Rummage in a Baptist church in my area. And I went there at Christmas time once and we heard this story. Now, this is a story, and think of who I'm referring to. There was a very, very wealthy man, and he lived in a big house by himself, and he had all kinds of goods, all kinds of material goods. He had beautiful paintings and beautiful furniture and just an amazing, amazing house. He lived in this gigantic house, and he had one son, and his son went off to war. And his son ended up taking a bullet for a friend, because that's, as Jesus said, what you do. That's the ultimate show of love, is you're willing to die for the people you love. And of course, Jesus died for our sins and for our salvation. Now, what happened was the person whom the son took the bullet for went back to the house and showed up at the door one day and saw the old man, the son's father, and he said, listen, I made this painting for you. Here's a painting. Take a look at this picture. And the old man looked at it and he saw a picture of a man looked just like his son. He said, this looks like my son. But he noticed the quality of the picture wasn't really that great, but something about the eyes really kind of shone through to him. It's almost like a spark in the eyes he saw in that painting. And of course it was it was a picture that was given out of love. And so he decided to take it, and it didn't compare to any of the other beautiful artwork that he had in his house. It didn't compare to any of the beautiful furniture or any of his appliances or all the other kinds of things he had amassed in his lifetime. But there was something about that picture he really liked. And so he hung it up really prominently over his fireplace. And one day he died, and they came, some auctioneers came to his house, and they decided to hold a huge auction to auction off all of his artwork, as was directed in his will. He said he wanted to auction everything off. And so the auctioneer got there, and the first thing he was going to auction off, according to the will, was going to be the picture of his son. So the auctioneer stood up there and he said, anyone want the picture? It's going, $20, or no, I'm sorry, $500. No one takes it. He gets down to about $50. $50. Going. Do I hear $50? Well, a little old lady came up and she said that was all she had. It was her only money. And she said, she had $50, but she really wanted to buy that picture. And so she bought the picture. I'm getting turned up because I like the story. So she bought the picture, and the auctioneer closed the whole auction. And he told everybody, auction's over. Everyone go in peace, love and serve the Lord. His mass is ended. Anyway, so he said the auction's over. And everyone was shocked. Like, what do you mean the auction's over? I was waiting to buy that artwork over there. I wanted to buy that furniture. I wanted to buy that couch. I wanted that refrigerator. Nope, the auction's over. The old man said that whoever bought this picture gets it all. And so that could be a reference to heaven. Okay, so if you're willing to invest a little bit of your heart and accept the offer that Jesus has given you of grace, he's willing to give you a piece of the kingdom. So Merry Christmas, everybody. You guys have a great one. Thank you so much. Anyway, let me go ahead and just say hi to everybody who's in the chat. If you came in here, if you're still here, I see that people who'd come in before, and I don't know if you're still here now, but we've got Blaster Master was here, Slam RN, Convis Contender, 6-stringed acoustic bassist, Jules B. There was a little conversation going back and forth, Brother John, and let's see here, Taking Back Eden, of course, that's John. So you guys, thank you so much for coming by. Praise Jesus says, Merry Christmas, sister. Yeah, you too. So you guys have a wonderful Christmas. I am going to have a lot of relatives coming to stay with me. I hope we all end up staying safe and healthy. But I've got, in this room that I'm in right now, I will not be able to do videos for a while because I not only have my brother-in-law, sister, and 2 kids, my mother-in-law and her brother all coming tonight to our house to stay with us. We also have, starting next week, after they leave, they're leaving on the 26th. On the 27th, we'll be arriving my sister and her big family. And so, wow, yeah, we're going to get a lot, and they're going to stay here through New Year's. And so I suspect I won't be back on, possibly on the 26th, depending on what time my in-laws leave, but I don't know. But other than that, I'm going to make one more video that I'm going to pop up as a preview, one of those premiere videos. I'm going to make one on something that might surprise you, but I'm going to make that soon, and I'm going to have that come up. So between now and the time that I will be able to get back on, but for sure I'll be back in the new year. Now you might be really excited to hear this. At 5 o'clock, mark your calendars, at 5 o'clock on Wednesday, January 6th, at 5 o'clock Eastern, I'm going to have Dr. Michael Brown come on my channel. He's willing to come on, and we're going to talk again about Jezebel's war on America. And we're going to talk about some of the things that have occurred coming out of maybe some communist desires. We're going to see that some of the communist desires from the year 1963 that are in our congressional records, some of those desires, ways that they wanted to destroy Western society, have been fulfilled. Okay, it's really scary stuff. And Dr. Michael Brown is willing to talk about it. He has written a book called Jezebel's War with America. So you guys definitely mark your calendars for that. It's going to be super exciting. Be sure to share that with people. And I hope you guys will like and subscribe, and please do come again. So thank you so much. Merry Christmas. So whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God.